Hi, everyone. So this week we're really one of my favorite subjects to talk about. I love virtue ethics just because I love to cultivate those parts of my personality that I feel like I can improve on. And it's really accessible to most people because we're all working on goals and we're all working to become better people and so that we can be better in our relationships, both like romantic relationships, friendships, or relationships at work. So I really love virtue ethics for this reason. There's lots to talk about, but we're going to be covering some key things in virtue ethics this week. And so we're going to be talking about Aristotle again. If you've been reading through or viewing my lectures, you'll notice I've talked about Aristotle quite a bit. He is one of the key virtue ethicists of all time. And so we'll be talking about Aristotle a lot. We'll be talking about Aquinas again. You were introduced to him in the last chapter. We'll be talking about virtue ethics as it relates to some Eastern concepts. Aristotle and Aquinas would be in the Western world of things, but now we're going to also move into some Eastern concepts of virtue ethics, and those are present in Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism. So I hope you are excited about these ideas like I am, and let's dive in and get started. So what is virtue ethics? Virtue ethics is really an approach to moral philosophy that emphasizes the role of character and virtue rather than rules. So we've talked about some rule-based things. We're going to be diving more into deontology. That is a rule-based ethical system. We're going to be diving more into consequentialist theories, and that will come later in the course. And essentially, it asks, what should I do in consequentialism according to consequences, or in deontology according to rules, like what is the best rule for what is right. But instead, virtue ethics is not asking that question or those questions. It is asking us, what kind of person should I be? And so one might be able to imply that if you're developing yourself into being a good person, a kind person, one with compassion and empathy and all these wonderful positive virtues, that will lead you to make better moral choices. So we could probably have a great argument on that, and hopefully we'll do so later in the class. But for now, let's talk a little bit first about Aristotle's virtue ethics. So his key text is the Nicomachean Ethics. And if you're interested in more information on that, I would be happy to provide you with that original source, and you can read his original ideas. So his idea, a key idea, is on flourishing or well-being, eudaimonia. The highest human good can be achieved through rational activity in accordance with virtue. So again, we're using our minds, it's internal, we're thinking about things rationally and critically. And so in Greek terms, this is called arete. That means virtue, which is excellence of character as developed through habituation. That means that we have to practice it over and over, and eventually it'll become a habit. So Aristotle also has this idea of the golden mean. So that means that virtue lies between two extremes. So there's deficiency on the one hand and excess on the other. So for example, courage is the mean between cowardness and recklessness, right? So cowardness might be the deficiency, while recklessness would be taking that act of courage too far. So this golden mean idea is really interesting. I think you'll see it's present in your life in a variety of ways. I encourage you to investigate the virtues that you currently think that you have, what the two extremes are, and where you sort of fall on the spectrum. So Aristotle has types of virtues. He has moral virtues, which are things like courage, temperance, generosity, but he also has intellectual virtues, things like wisdom, understanding, and practical judgment, or phronesis. So in our moral development, then, our virtues are acquired through practice by guided reasoning. So we're learning to become better and better thinkers. So moral education then becomes essential. And there's a strong emphasis in Aristotle's philosophy on community and mentorship. So if we contrast that against Aquinas' sense of virtue ethics, I'll mention first that Aquinas' key text is called the Summa Theologica. And his core concept is this idea that he synthesizes Aristotelian ethics with Christian theology. You may have heard of the Beatitudo, the blessedness or ultimate happiness, and that is found in union with God or with the ultimate good. So if you practice one of the religions of Abraham, Christianity, Judaism, or Islam, then you will have come across these concepts before. And some people, even Indo-Eastern traditions, believe that in order for us to become happy, we need to unite ourselves either with God, as in the Western tradition, or in the Eastern tradition, kind of with this universal reality, this wholeness, and that we won't really feel happy until we've found this unification with the ultimate good. So Aquinas retains Aristotle's natural virtues, but then he adds in some theological virtues. And his theological virtues are the cardinal virtues from Aristotle and the Stoics, like prudence, justice, fortitude, temperance. And then the theological virtues, which are things like faith, hope, and charity. And those are infused by God and necessary for salvation. So this might be a great time to break out your journal if you're reflecting on some of these ideas, and just jot down what you think about these virtues, whether or not they're important in your life, and how they play out. So he believes that our moral development then begins with natural reason, but is perfected by this sense of divine grace. That human flourishing includes both temporal and eternal dimensions. So going beyond just we might find here on our earthly world and going into the spiritual. So virtue then is a cooperation between free will and divine aid. So jumping down into ideas in Buddhist virtue ethics. So the key texts here are the Dhammapada and the Eightfold Path, the Jatakas, and these are all some great things to read if you enjoy Buddhism or learning more about Buddhism. And I highly recommend reading the Four Agreements. It's a short book, and it kind of outlines these agreements that we make with ourselves that can lead us out of suffering to greater happiness. So some of the core concepts in Buddhist virtue ethics would be this ultimate goal is nirvana, or liberation from suffering, called dukkha. The cycle of rebirth is called samsara. And so we want to get out of this cycle of rebirth, and we're going to keep being reborn until we learn these lessons and stop our suffering. And stopping our suffering comes from mindfulness, from ethical purification, and from wisdom. And so virtue ethics is integrated in this path towards enlightenment. So we can really overcome our suffering by mastering our minds. So I mentioned the Noble Eightfold Path and the paramitas. And these virtues, there's four of them that we can take a look here. Sila, which is our ethical conduct. We want to have the right speech, right actions, and the right livelihood. And by right livelihood, that just means something that's positive in our lives and isn't toxic. something that doesn't harm other people, but instead encourages their human flourishing. And then there's Pana, or wisdom, the right view and intention. There's Samadhi, which is a mental discipline, which means we're putting forth the right effort, mindfulness, and concentration. And then there's the 6 paramitas, which is a Mahayana concept. If you've studied any Buddhism in the past, there are different forms of Buddhism, different traditions. Mahayana is one of them, and that contrasts against, maybe you've heard of Zen Buddhism or Theravadan Buddhism. So all some things that you could dive into on your own. We're really just doing an overview in this class, but at least we're hitting some key concepts that you might then later go to and think, I found that idea interesting, and I'm going to investigate that further maybe after the class is finished, or if you have time during the class. So going back to the 6 paramitas, they're generosity, morality, patience, effort, meditation, and wisdom. So our moral development then in Buddhism develops through meditation. Meditation is the practice from which we can then go out into the world and conduct ourselves in a mindful way. It has to do with compassionate action. Through meditation, we learn to be more mindful and act more compassionately towards others. So our intentions then, our ethical actions should arise from these wholesome mental states that we're cultivating through meditation. And another important concept of Buddhism is that there is no permanent self. This is called anatta, A-N-A-T-T-A. And that means that virtue is not about a fixed self, but about transforming our stream of consciousness. So moving on into Confucian virtue ethics, some key texts are the Analects, the Misuse, and Zunais. So the core concept of Confucian virtue ethics. This is an ethics that's rooted in human relationships and social harmony. So remember, it's coming out of the East. So human relationships and social harmony working together comes before our sense of individualism. So there's in the Eastern way, our social relationships are important, whereas in the Western way, our individualism and autonomy is important. So those two things come into contrast with one another. So in Confucianism, the ideal person is a noble or exemplary person. And the ultimate goal is a well-ordered society through this cultivated character. So some of the key virtues that you would want to work on if you were practicing this system of virtue ethics would be Ren, or benevolence and humanness. This is the highest virtue that is expressing love and compassion. Li, which would be ritual propriety. That means that contains social harmony and respect towards others. Yi, Y-I, is righteousness, and that is doing what is right regardless of personal gain. Z, or wisdom, and Zin, faithfulness. So those would be the virtues that you would be paying attention to if you were following a system of Confucian virtue ethics. So our moral development then in this system would take place through education, self-reflection, and role models. So virtue is context sensitive in this system, and it's dependent on one's social roles and duties. So where do you fall in your family? What is your role in your family? It would be duty to family first, and that would be even over and above the sense of duty to self, which we're more used to in our Western traditions. So human nature is seen as fundamentally good or needing correction. But in both cases, virtue requires cultivation. So let's move more down now into Taoist virtue ethics. And you may have heard of Lao Tzu or the Tao Te Ching. That was probably the text that you might be the most familiar with if you've studied any Taoist virtue ethics. So the core concepts in Taoist virtue ethics are that it focuses on living in accordance with the Tao or the Way, and that Way is the natural order of the universe. It has an emphasis on wu wei, or non-action, or effortless action. That is, acting in harmony with nature without force or some kind of excessive effort. So you should be in balance when you're acting. And it contrasts with Confucian emphasis on ritual and social roles. So here we're getting back more into that sense of individualism and cultivating ourselves. So some of the key virtuists in the Taoist tradition are Di, which is virtue or power. And this is the expression of the Tao or the Way in a person's life, how we live out our lives in a virtuous way. So it's taught that we want to live simply, with humility, naturally, compassionately, and in moderation. So in order to develop morals in this area, virtue would arise not from learning or social training, but from unlearning artificial distinctions and desires. So a sage, right, a wise person who embodies these key virtues would be spontaneous, open, and in harmony with the Tao or the Way. So there is some skepticism of rigid moral systems and an emphasis on intuition and nature. So really, in conclusion, comparing and contrasting all of these virtues, the traditions emphasize that virtue is essential to moral life, and their understanding of virtue varies significantly throughout Aristotle, Aquinas, Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism. But together they can offer us a rich and diverse tapestry of how human beings can live meaningful and virtuous lives by rational cultivation of a stable character, by internal transformation and alignment with the nature of reality, and by thinking of our social roles and relationships and emphasizing harmony within these ethical rituals. So I hope you enjoyed this brief lecture on virtue ethics. As you can see, there's a lot to unpack. I hope you'll dive more deeply into some of the ideas that I've mentioned as we continue on through the course.